Howdy, Taylor Marshall here. We're continuing an interview with Dave Palmer. In the first segment, Dave talked to us about how he read the entire Summa 3 times and how you can also. And we're going to continue the discussion. We're going to talk about applying the Summa to our daily life and our interactions. So thanks for being back with us, Dave.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I made the second segment. You didn't
That's
kick
right.
me out
We
after
didn't-
the first.
We
That's
didn't
good.
beat you, yeah. So in the first half, we talked about how to read the Summa, how to have the perseverance. How has that reading of the Summa over time affected your instruction as a parent, as a husband, as a colleague? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, well, all the above.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, first of all, it kind of dispels the notions that we typically have. I mean, when people think of God the Father, they think of the bearded man up upstairs, maybe firing, throwing down thunderbolts, or they think of angels, the typical image that we get. But needless to say, in the first part that like we talked about, you really get a real detailed description of all these God and all the creatures. And as far as being a father, we have a cat and we have fish, and so
Right.
I'll going to like the fifth proof of the existence of God. I'll pull my 8-year-old or my 5-year-old daughters over, and I'll say, that's interesting that fish swimming around in the tank there. Maura, how do you think that what's making that fish move? Or do you think the fish is consciously thinking of what it's doing? Or and she doesn't know instincts or all that. And
Right.
I'd say, does God have a part in that fish moving around? Which,
And what does she say?
well, she knows the right answer.
What was her first answer?
Well, I don't know, Daddy. Can I go back and play with my Barbie?
Yeah, right.
But or I'll, of course, God's moving all things. He's present in all things through His power. As we learn in the first part of the Summa. One night I was they're going to bed, and my 2 daughters sleep on the same bed together, and the cat was up there, our cat Goretti, named after Saint Maria Goretti, and I'll say, Ina, what's the difference between you and Goretti? What is the fundamental difference?
She and the cat.
Her
Okay.
and the cat, not
Okay.
the saint.
Yeah.
And they by now they know the answer. We have intelligence. The cat does not have an intellect. The cat
Right.
doesn't have free will. When the cat messes up or throws up on the carpet, we don't spank it.
Right.
And we wouldn't spank our daughter if she threw up on the carpet either. But when she when they do something wrong, so it's really from a practical standpoint really cool. And even from my own standpoint, like I told you before we started here today, I don't look at anything the same anymore. I don't. If I see a grasshopper, or if I see a bird or a cloud or a tree, everything is different. Everything has changed because of having this new information, in my head.
See, I think that's what's so great about reading Thomas Aquinas is it's not just like this intellectual, scholastic pursuit for the sake of knowledge, but it really does change your worldview. You see the world in a different way.
Yeah.
On the way over here, I saw a big flock of seagulls or geese or something. They were really high up and they were moving south. And I was just amazed by that and thinking about, the order of nature. And Thomas Aquinas loves the order of nature. He's a real student of Albert the Great in that way.
Yeah.
And I think as Catholics, we have to not just have a great awe and wonder for heaven, but we also have an awe and wonder for God's greatness in the glory of creation as He's made it. And Thomas is able to bring all of that together.
Especially since in our culture today, especially with the media and how important that is in forming minds, God is pretty much taken out of the picture. So everything has kind of a scientific explanation. Everything can be, I guess, kind of a positivism type of approach. Where if we can't explain it, then we're not going to talk about it.
Right.
But it does bring God into everything. Of course, if God isn't here, you and I can't have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so and also I teach a high school class online, the Summa. And one thing I tell the kids, I said, if you're praying less because you're reading the Summa, then I've been a failure. And so
you're doing it wrong.
You're doing it wrong. So you also every now, quite often have to say, God, thank you for those seagulls, thank you for those ducks, that bird, thank you for our cat, even when he throws up on the carpet.
Right. So when you're teaching these young people, what are the ages you're teaching Summa to?
The youngest student I've had is 13, and the oldest would be 18. So it's generally 14, 18-year-olds, but there was one brilliant young guy that wanted to take it at 13.
And tell us about him. I mean, was he able to comprehend at 13?
Yeah,
Thomas.
he told me that it was the best class he ever took. He was a guy that wanted to be a priest.
Okay.
I think he's a young man who knows exactly what he wants to do.
Right.
And he was into it. And he probably had to beg his mom and dad to let him take Aquinas at 13, but
Yeah.
he did well. The mind develops as they get older. He didn't get 100.
Sure.
He didn't ace it, but for a 13-year-old to be reading Thomas and kind of getting it, that's pretty good.
Yeah. Now, what about in daily conversations? I mean, you can't just, oh, Thomas says in the, Secunda Secundae, question 92, people are probably going to glaze over and tune you out. But, I mean, are there opportunities in which the things you've learned, the things you've read have been able to be applied to conversations or helping people or your marriage or all of the above?
Yeah, one of the important ones I've had this with, a lot of people and my kids in particular is that a lot of times when people say somebody dies, they'll say, well, I have an angel in heaven now, and without being too much of an intellectual snob, I'll say, well, actually you don't.
Right.
But the important thing is I say, well, if you say that, you discount the body. And
Yes.
you discount the importance of our body, and and then you can even get into a conversation about John Paul II and the theology of the body, and saying, we will never be angels,
Right.
just like we'll never be a grasshopper.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing.
Angels have a higher nature than we do.
And they don't have bodies. Of course, they
Right.
can assume bodies.
Yeah.
But,
And we have the resurrection of the body.
Yeah.
We'll get our body back. So
Yeah, and
point.
so that's one example of something. A lot of people say that, and they mean the right thing, but I think it's a very bad error to get into because, first of all, and I love the angels because if we can understand the angels, we're kind of getting one step closer to God.
Precisely.
We don't want to relate too much to our dog. We have a lot in common with our dog and the
Right.
passions and the body,
Yeah.
but we'd rather kind of take a step up and try to understand the angelic mind because that's
right.
the part of us that is made to the image and likeness of God. And so
Exactly.
a kind of a stair-step approach to understanding God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, in our conversations, you'd mentioned how as you were reading the Summa for the first time, you were in the third part, you were in the section on the sacrament of penance, and you got to the part where Thomas, historically, he died in that part. He never finished the Summa Theologiae. And you said you kind of had an emotional response. Share that with us.
Yeah, it was, having read for, I guess at that point, for 8 months, one author, like any book you read, you get you get an attachment to the author. You kind of get to know him. Thomas doesn't tell you a lot about himself. In fact, he uses the first person pronoun very rarely.
Yes.
In fact, I circled every time an I came out.
I'd like to see that list.
Yeah, and he does it every now and then, but very rarely. He doesn't. He's not like Augustine. He doesn't tell you a lot
Right.
about himself. But we got to the point in the when the supplement starts and the explanation comes that Thomas died and from this Reginald completed it and that.
Yeah.
And I just felt like this is no longer Thomas writing the Summa. Now, of course, most of it's still Thomas's words,
Right.
But going back to when he was in his 20s, or his commentary on the sentences of Lombard and all
Yes.
that. But yeah, I felt bad. But I got to say though, as I read into that, I didn't notice that much of a difference.
Right.
The language is still the same, and I got over it pretty quickly. But yeah. I was saddened.
What about the conversation with your wife? I mean, she's over the years is seeing you with this 5-volume set of books, right? I don't know if you're lugging them off to work or they're on your nightstand or next to your favorite chair. But over the years, I'm sure she's had some comments about you and your Summa obsession. Share that with us.
Yeah, well, my wife is from Ireland, and not that really matters, but just and she has more of a charismatic type of spirituality. She was in the, and so hers is not kind of like this is not her necessarily her thing. But I would be up late at night reading, and then sometimes I'd come into the room at 12 or 12:30, and if she gets up, I'd say, "Can I just tell you what I just read?" Or did you know this? Or
Yeah.
and then she's like, "Oh, come on, it's 12:30. Can you give it a break?" But I will say she appreciated that I was reading it, because there's certainly a lot of worse things you could be reading. Wives
course.
could certainly be
Right.
upset that their husbands are reading worse things in the Summa.
Right.
And there was that one question that Thomas asks about whether a man should love more his father or his wife. And I said, hey.
And what does he say for people
He said
watching?
he should have more love for his father, because that his father is his principle, the principle from whence he came.
And it relates to honor thy father and mother.
Yeah, and so my wife didn't like that one too much. So she's like, really? You love your father more than your. Of course, but Thomas writes beautifully on marriage and women and things like that. So, but yeah, that one didn't go over too well.
Yeah. Now, so people, in the first segment, we talked about reading the Summa all the way through, right? What do you think is the most difficult section of the Summa? You'd mentioned the part on the law and the old law, but for me, I would think people who are reading it, there's some really heady philosophical sections, especially in the first part.
Yeah.
When he's talking about the soul and the body, when he's talking about the nature of God, but the Trinity and the processions and the missions of the persons, I mean, that can be pretty hard to read.
Yeah.
In your first round through, were you fazed by that, or were you just loving it?
Oh yeah, I loved it, but I didn't understand everything. And to be honest with you, my favorite part is also what I consider to be probably the most difficult part, because when you get into the second part, he's talking about the virtues and the vices and sin, and that's not that difficult to understand.
Sure.
I mean, that's he puts it in a way that really is wonderful, but it's not that difficult. But the epistemology, and especially when it's coming, these things like intellectual species and how angels can come to know many things at one time, and abstracting how our active and passive intellect.
Yes.
And I gotta admit, I don't 100% understand that right now. I mean,
Right.
I teach it, and I try to explain it as best as I can. But even Thomas says, these are things that really transcend our ability to know. I mean, we can kind of do our best at understanding it, but many of the things, especially with God, transcends the capability of our nature. So yeah, I'd say that's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough to understand all that.
I have the experience still where I'll read an article, and I'll get through it. I'll go through all the objections, and I get the gist. Of course, he makes it very clear what he says and all. But there are times still where I think, okay, I got to go back and read it again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are times when still I just get bogged down in it, and sometimes the arguments can get pretty complex, especially in that first part. I think.
Yeah.
When we're talking about causality and potentiality, actuality, and so on and so forth. So, okay, well, what would be your word of exhortation, your challenge to people who are watching right now? They've watched the first interview, they've watched the second, they're fired up, they're ready to do it. What's your word of exhortation?
I would have 3 bits of advice.
Okay, good.
And first of all, I would say, and as you have said before, read Chesterton's The Dumb Ox. Maybe before you get into the Summa, if you
Good.
can, because it's not a big book. It's maybe 150 to 200 pages.
Very
it's
accessible.
It's a very easy read.
Written beautifully.
And I will say also, and I mean this sincerely, read your Thomas in 50 pages. I read that after I read the Summa 3 times, and it still was really helpful to me. I use it.
I did not pay Dave to
no,
say
no,
that.
no.
I did not know he was going to say that.
It's a free book.
Yeah, it's a free book.
So no, seriously, that's
Okay.
very helpful. Your whole explanation of the 4 causes and the way what is it the equivocal and the univocal and the analogical, and,
Yeah.
and you also say if you don't understand this part, you've got to understand the
Yes.
The analogy of being, for example,
Yes.
so that's very helpful. The third thing is, if you want to get really fired up about reading Aquinas, you got to read Aeterni Patris, which I think most Summas have.
And tell
it.
people what the Aeterni Patris
Yeah,
is.
that's the 1879 encyclical by Pope Leo XIII on the restoration of Christian philosophy according to the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas. Because I'll tell you about gosh, 10, 12 years ago, Humana Vitae changed my life. I read that, that's pretty short, and I never thought of, especially sexual ethics and the church the same. And Eternity Patris, 12 years later, had the same impact.
Yeah.
Those are the two encyclicals that changed my life. And basically, as you know, he's saying, even back then in 1879, the world has been infiltrated by a lot of these bad philosophers, bad philosophies, and we gotta fight it. And the best way to fight it is go back to scholastic philosophy, the master being Thomas.
Thomas, yeah.
So that'd be my advice.
Yeah, well, that's good. So lay the groundwork with some supplemental reading beforehand, just to get the feel, and then get into the Summa.
I think so, yeah.
Great.
Or you can do it all at the same time. If you're so excited, because if you had told me, 5 years ago to hold off,
right,
and read these other 3 books
Yeah.
before, I would have said no.
Yeah.
I got to get into it. So you can read them at the same time.
So follow your heart too. Okay, great. All right. Well, we hope that was helpful. Dave, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Loved it.
Well, thank you
Great
very
interview.
much.
And go for it. Get the Summa, open it up, start reading, and your life will never be the same. Thank you so much, and God bless.